see such a large crowd tonight. I want to also mention that our public programs are brought to you through contributions to the Carey Institute, particularly from those that have joined our signature level of contribution, the Aldo Leopold Society. This allows us to do events like this on a regular basis, and we hope that you both enjoy the events and will want to support them. Let me mention that the next lecture in our series, we're going to break the Friday night tradition here for the next lecture. It will be on a Thursday night. Frances Beinecke, who's director of the Natural Resources Defense Council, will be here to talk about her experience on Obama's committee that examined the Gulf oil spill, what lessons learned, she hopes not lessons spurned, but she will be here to relay her experiences on that commission and what she learned about the Gulf oil spill. Now tonight we're very happy to have Donovan Hohn here to talk to us about his new book, Moby-Duck. Let me also say that like many of the book events that we do here, it's co-sponsored by the Merritt Bookstore, and after the lecture and a little bit of Q&A, Donovan will be available to sign copies of his book for those of you that might like to have purchased one. Now, Moby-Duck, I've been in science for a bunch of years, and I've used rulers and meter sticks and microscopes and balances to weigh things. Never have I contemplated the possibility that some science might come from the use of rubber duckies in nature. Inadvertent, though, the spill of rubber duckies in this particular case may have been. But in fact, some interesting science and some interesting insights to the function of the oceans came out of that spill of toy duckies. We're going to hear about that tonight and some of the things that can be drawn from that event. Donovan is a former English teacher, a former senior editor of Harper's, now the feature editor at GQ. That must be fun as well. Moby-Duck is his first book, which the New York Times described as a cautionary environmental tale, a deconstruction of consumer demand, and a meditation on wilderness and imagination. All of those, I think, will be interesting for us to hear about and react to tonight. Donovan lives in New York with his wife and sons and has come up here to do this presentation. Please welcome him.
There's a map up here. There are maps at the beginning of the book. The kind of story that the book tells, kind of journeys that I took, require a map, so we'll begin here. Are there any Melville fans in the audience? If you listen closely, you may hear a few allusions. Several years ago, never mind how many exactly, I found myself alone in Sitka, Alaska. There it is, red star. One rainy night, with nothing better to do, I went to the watering hole favored by fishermen, the Pioneer Bar, or P-Bar it's called in Sitka, in hopes of interviewing the natives. There I had a chance to meet a somewhat elderly woman in a leather jacket, sitting at the bar. When informed of the reason for my visit to Sitka, I was chasing a story of 28,800 bath toys lost at sea, hundreds of which had first made landfall near Sitka in 1993. She paused between drags on her cigarette and said, "Who the heck gives a rat's took us about that?" That's actually a paraphrase, because I saw there's some kids in the audience who are actually saltier. Then without warning, she reached out, snapped the hood of my yellow slicker over my head, and barked, "You look like a rubber duck." The interview ended with her commanding me to quack, and with me obliging her in this request, and with the denizens of the P-Bar laughing at my expense. I'm not going to repeat the performance now. Who cares about the story of 28,800 bath toys lost at sea? It's a good question, and one I hope to answer in several ways tonight. But a warning about questions. Every now and then I'm going to speak somewhat informally, somewhat from notes, and sometimes from the book, regarding questions. Questions I've learned can be like ocean currents. Wade in a little too far, and they can carry you away. Follow one line of inquiry, and it will lead you to another and another. Spot a yellow duck dropped atop the seaweed at the tide line. Ask yourself where it came from, and the next thing you know, you're way out at sea. No land in sight. Dog paddling around in mysteries 4 miles deep. You're wondering when and why yellow ducks became icons of childhood. You want to know what it's like inside the toy factories of Guangdong. You're marveling at the scale of humanity's impact on this terraqueous globe and at the oceanic magnitude of your own ignorance. You're giving the plight of the latest albatross, about which we'll hear more, many moments of thought. The next thing you know, it's the middle of the night, and you're on the outer decks of a post-Panamax freighter, due south of the Aleutians, due south of the Aleutian Island, where in 1741, shipwrecked, Vitus Bering perished from scurvy and hunger. The winds are gale force, the water is deep and black, and so is the sky. It's snowing, the decks are slick, your ears ache, your fingers are numb. Solitary, nocturnal circumambulations of the outer decks by supernumerary passengers are strictly forbidden. For good reason. Fall overboard and no one would miss you. You inhale the ocean and go down alone. Nevertheless, there you are, not a goner yet, gazing up at the shipping containers stacked 6 high overhead, and from them cataracts of snow-melted rain are spattering down. There you are, listening to the stacked containers strain against their lashings, creaking and groaning and cataracting with every roll. And with every roll you are wondering what, in the name of Neptune, it would take to make stacks of steel, or for that matter, aluminum containers fall. But we'll start with the first question, the one that the woman asked me in the Pioneer Bar. Who cares about the story of 28,800 bath toys lost at sea? And I'll begin with the obvious answer, the one that caused me to care in the first place, because it's a good story. The fable of the 28,800 bath toys lost at sea. Perhaps you've heard it before. It inspired children's books. And it made frequent appearances in newspapers, usually under headlines like this one that Eric Carl happened on. You can see it up there. It says, "Rubber ducks lost at sea." If you go down a little bit, some of these rubber toys have washed up on the shores of Alaska, while others have made their way through Bering Strait past icebergs around the northern coast of Greenland, the Atlantic Ocean. Here's a clipping from the New York Times, a brief appearance. Again, some of the recurring elements of the novel. Armada of faded yellow toy ducks is expected to make landfall in Britain. It even says there, somewhere up there, that remnants of the flotilla are on their way down the eastern seaboard of the United States, having crossed the Arctic. Although a breakaway group has been spotted, it says, on its way to Britain. When this story, into my own imagination in the winter of 2005, I was actually, at the time, a high school English teacher, but I wrote journalism for magazines in my summers, a double life, and I taught a journalism course in which I asked my students to investigate an object, and one of my students, sweet kid, who called himself Big Papa, was his preferred nickname, carried around a little duck in his pocket, left duck he called it, and he decided to write about his duck, and he was the one who found a little news item like this one. And reading his paper that night, I found myself enchanted, trying to picture the scene on the North Pacific in 1992. I tried to picture what it would be like for these toys to drift boldly and cheerfully across the Arctic, where explorers had traveled disastrously before. And I started to picture things like this. That's an ad for a British cell phone company from 2006. So the story has become so legendary that it's even appearing on billboards. Or else I found myself thinking of the beachcombers of New England who were supposed to begin seeing the ducks in the summer of 2003. I started imagining things like that. It's a painting that I did a story, just the first couple chapters of the book, about 1/5 of the book, started as a story for Harper's Magazine. That's a big show to illustrate with. And most of all, though, I found myself wishing I could imagine the story in realistic detail. And I found myself wishing, like the boy in Paddle to the Sea, if anyone remembers that classic children's book, wishing what he wished as he, atop a mountain, launches his hand-carved wooden Indian in a canoe on an epic journey to the sea. The snow will melt, he says to his Indian, and the water will run downhill to the river and on down to the Great Lakes, down again and on at last to the sea. You will go with the water and you will have adventures that I would like to have. Now, that boy in that story, wiser than I am, didn't actually try to have the adventures that his canoe did. I, however, was foolish enough to set out and try to reenact the journey of the choice. It's a good story, but as I learned during the course of my adventures, it turned out to be at least in part fabulous, in the literal sense of that word. You'll notice that I've been saying the fable of the rubber ducks lost at sea. My adventures also convinced me, however, that Thoreau was right when he said this. He wrote in Walden, "If men would steadily observe realities only and not allow themselves to be deluded, life would be like a fairy tale." The novelist Reconstructing described my book as distressingly wonderful, and what I think she meant is that, there it is that the story as I've told it, the true story of the 28,800 battlers lost at sea and of the beachcombers, oceanographers, environmentalists, and fools, including the author, who went in search of them, inspires both wonder and distress. I'd like to think a little more of the former than the latter. But before we go any further on this around-the-world ducky hunt through latitudes of wonder and distress, a clarification. What is it exactly we're going hunting for? The title of the book is singular, Moby-Duck, but in a way the quarry I was chasing was plural, or at least it took many forms. It changed. It shape-shifted. I set out in pursuit of the yellow duck you see on the cover. I hope you won't feel cheated to learn that this image was made with the help of Photoshop. It isn't real. This duck, this golden icon of childhood, is the fabulous duck. And I hunted for it in the annals of folklore and myth, the way Melville's Ishmael hunts for his white whale in libraries, as well as on the South Pacific. But here, in fact, are the real bath toys that fell off that container ship in 1992, posed on my bathroom floor, photographed by my wife. And I hunted them too, all over the Northern Hemisphere. Notice the supporting cast of characters, the much neglected green frog, blue turtle, red beaver, the one that doesn't belong, the red beaver, Bow scale, maraschino red, a mammal. So there's that. Or perhaps it would be more rigorous still to say that this is the duck I want to hunt for. Hunted for, and to my astonishment, when I first set out, I never expected to find any of these toys. After all, there are so many thousands of miles of coastline in the ocean, they're so vast. But lo and behold, in July of 2007, on the outer coast of Alaska's Kenai wilderness, I found the beaver over there on the right, no longer so red, in the lee of a spruce tree. And somebody I was coming with found the duck on the left and was mercifully gave it to me because he knew how badly I wanted it. That's what they look like after 15 years. Some of those years at sea, some of them on the floor of a forest on the Alaskan coast. And if you look closely, maybe try this gizmo. Right around here, there's a crack under the duck's bill. This isn't, to be clear, another reason why the fable of the rubber ducks lost at sea is a fable. Is that duck isn't rubber. It's a plastic duck. To be precise, it's a polyethylene duck. And here's the thing about plastics. Petrochemical plastics, which are most of them, don't decompose, don't biodegrade, nothing can digest them. So they can persist at sea for decades and chemically for centuries. But sunlight makes the long molecular chains of polymers break apart. That duck, by the time I rescued it, had grown pretty brittle, so remember that. I also hunted for this duck. There it is, the plastic factory in Dongguan, China, that made the original 4 toys. The one hanging from the bag isn't one of the actual floaties, as they're called. Hey, but close enough. And I was looking for this duck. That's the actual mold from which the toy duck sprang. I wanted to know, when I set out, where the toys had drifted and why. I wanted to determine their fate, but I also wanted to determine their origins. And there it is, there's a mold made by the late father of the owner of the posing factory. You can go back farther, though, because you could figure out where the plastic came from, where the polyethylene came from. When I set out, I didn't know what plastic was, I'm ashamed to admit. I thought it was some sort of magic substance in everything. And that if I had tried to picture how it was made, I would have imagined, I don't know, Dayglow fluids flowing through crazy straws or something. And in fact, as I learned, it's in most cases a derivative of oil. What is oil? See what happens when you let questions carry you away. So oil, primordial sunlight, photosynthesized by primordial plankton, then baked by geothermal processes into subterranean ooze. And you go back far enough, then you learn that the toys came from the ocean. And to the ocean they returned. Which brings us to the image in my quarry that may be most relevant to tonight's venue, this image. All right. You don't see the backwards here? That bird is not a duck on the left. It's a lace and albatross chick, a dead one. And that pretty mandala on the right is made out of the 252 items that a wildlife biologist removed from the dead bird's digestive tract. It's plastic mostly. And remember how plastic photodegrades, gets brittle, well, there it is. For all we know, the remains of a toy beaver or a duck may be among those plastic shards on the right. We do know that one of the toys made it to Curie Atoll, which is not far from the lace and island, for which the lace and albatross is named. Because I expect that there might be some ecologists in the room tonight, I'll pay a little more attention to this image of my quarry than to others, but first a note of caution. This image, too, is in part illusory. So I'd ask you to keep in mind a wise little aside that the ecologist Garrett Hardin included in his influential essay for Science magazine, The Tragedy of the Commons. In that essay, Hardin, really just an aside, had very little bearing to his argument, said this. He said, the morality of an act cannot be determined from a photograph. It is as tempting to ecologists as it is to reformers in general to try to persuade others by way of the photographic shortcut. But the essence of an argument cannot be photographed. It must be presented rationally in words. So, questions have carried us pretty far. Let's go to C and try hard to observe realities. It is hard, probably impossible to observe them only, as Thoreau recommended. And let's begin at the beginning. Out here. Okay. After trying really hard to imagine how it really happened, this is what I came up with for the spill. We know where the spill occurred. 44.7 degrees north, 178.1 degrees east, south of the Aleutians, near the international date line, in the stormy latitudes renowned in the age of sail as the graveyard of the Pacific. just north of what oceanographers, who are on the whole less poetic than mariners of the Age of Sail, call the subarctic front. We know the date, January 10th, 1992, but not the hour. For years, the identity of the ship was a well-kept secret, but by consulting old shipping schedules published in the Journal of Commerce and preserved on scratched spools of microfiche in a library basement, I, by process of elimination, solved this particular riddle. The ship was the Evergreen Ever Laurel, owned by a Greek company called Technomar Shipping, whose fur green containers with the company's curiously sylvan name emblazoned across them in white block letters can be seen around harbors all over the world. No spools of microfiche have preserved the identities of the officers and crew, however, let alone their memories of what happened that stormy day or night. And if the logbook from the voyage still exists, it has been secreted away to some corporate archive. We know that the ship departed, go back here. We know that the ship departed Hong Kong on January 6th, that it arrived in the port of Tacoma on January 16th, a day behind schedule, and that the likely cause for this delay was rough weather. How rough exactly remains unclear. Although it did so on other days, on January 10th, the Ever Laurel did not fax a weather report to the National Weather Service in Washington, D.C. The following morning, a ship in its vicinity did, describing hurricane-force winds and waves 36 feet high. If the Ever Laurel had encountered similarly tempestuous conditions, we can imagine, if only vaguely, what might have transpired, despite its grandeur. Rocked by waves as tall as brownstones, the colossal vessel, a floating warehouse weighing 28,904 deadweight tons and powered by a diesel engine the size of a barn, would have rolled and pitched and yawed about like a toy in a jacuzzi. At some point on the steep roll, 2 columns of containers stacked 6 high above deck snapped loose from their steel lashings and tumbled overboard. We can safely assume that the subsequent splash was terrific, like that a train would make were you to drive it off the seaside cliff. We know that each of the 12 containers measured 8 feet wide and either 20 or 40 feet long, and that at least one of them, perhaps when it careened into another container, perhaps when it struck the ship's rails, burst or buckled open as it fell. We know that as the water gushed in and the container sank, dozens of cardboard boxes would have come bobbing to the surface, that one by one they too would have come apart, discharging thousands of little packages onto the sea, that every package comprised a plastic shell and a cardboard back, that every shell housed 4 hollow plastic animals. You've already met them, so I'll skip down a little bit. And then on the cardboard, and printed on the cardboard in colorful letters, in a bubbly childlike font, were the following words: the first years, floaties. They float in tub or pool, play and discover. Made in China, dishwasher safe. From a low-flying plane on a clear day, the packages would have looked like confetti, a great drift of colorful squares, exploding in slow motion across the waves. Within 24 hours, the water would have dissolved the glue. The action of the waves would have separated the plastic shell from the cardboard back. There in seas almost 4 miles deep, more than 500 miles south of Attu Island, at the tip of Hokkaido, the northern extreme of Japan, and more than 2,000 miles west of the insular Alaskan city of Sitka, 28,800 plastic animals produced in Chinese factories for the bathtubs of America, hatched from their plastic shells and drifted free. That's good. That part of the story is good. But then it gets a little better. Because 11 years later, 10,000 circuitous miles to the east, a beachcomber named Beth Hoggins and her boyfriend Wayne Welton spotted something small and bright perched atop the seaweed at the southwest end of Gooch's Beach. And in a way, that's where my journey began, right there. I think I have a photo. No. Where'd they go? There they are. Gooch's Beach. It's misty and mysterious, and they couldn't find their toy. And part of the mystery here is that they didn't keep their evidence. In fact, Wayne Welton, this guy, believes that the duck he saw was yellow, whereas his girlfriend Beth thinks that it was white. And upon that difference, much depends, because as you've already seen, the toys at sea would have been white by now had they made it through the Arctic. We know about all these toys because of an oceanographer named Curtis Ettenmeyer, who lives in Seattle, professional oceanographer, who is semi-retirement, now in retirement, took up a hobby that is also a serious pursuit, which is the study of flotsam. and he publishes his newsletter. And he began with a shipment of Nikes that fell off a container ship, using them as an accidental oceanographic experiment. You have point A, the spill, and then you've got lots of beachcombers who subscribe to your newsletter telling you where they find things. You can trace the drift route and you can follow the currents. You don't know what's in between point A and point B, which is why most oceanographers no longer use flotsam to study the currents. They use basically underwater droids that can communicate by satellite. I see some of those in use too. But it certainly makes for a good story, and in some ways possibly can be makes for good science as well. He's published a couple of papers in peer-reviewed scientific journals, and some oceanographers do think that it's certainly as useful as other drift experiments. So from him, I received this map. You'll note what I've circled over there, the question marks off the coast of Maine, because as one of those beachcombers said, there's no science, no proof. Have they made it through the Ecological or not? Of the many questions I sought to answer, this one was the one that preoccupied me and took most of the book to answer. Have they made it, or was it all just make-believe? When I went to Gooch's Beach on July 6, 2005, standing there at high tide, gazing out into the misty Atlantic, what I wanted to do was to climb into a dinghy and row out to a motorboat and go out across the Gulf of Maine and onto an icebreaker and go through the Northwest Passage all the way back to the site of the spill. I didn't do it then. My wife was pregnant, but I did eventually go through the Northwest Passage on an icebreaker. But let's get back here to the spill and back to this question of where did the toys go? Where did they drift? And you'll see down here something called the North Pacific Subtropical Convergence Zone. The North Pacific Subtropical Convergence Zone is just a place. There are, you'll see here, these circles of arrows form gyres, which are circuits of currents. Our own Gulf Stream nearby is just the counterpart of Japanese Kuroshio current, which is here. It's one arc of a big circle that goes around and around, revolving. But you may notice up here, the currents, the arrows go in a counterclockwise direction. And they interlock this North Pacific gyre and this subtropical gyre. They interlock almost like revolving gears. And here, in the subtropical gyre, the currents converge. So you must imagine like a whirlpool or something, but on a much, much larger scale, millions of miles of ocean. They revolve inward and they collect flotsam as they do so. Up here in the Gulf of Alaska, the opposite of that happens. The currents tend to expel flotsam towards shore. So down here, there's formed what has become notoriously known as the Great Pacific Garbage Patch, which is in some ways a misleading name. Yeah, that's Kamilo Beach, also known as Plastic Beach in South Point, Hawaii. The reason why the garbage patch is a bit of a misleading name is, I know certainly when I first heard of it, I imagined pumpkin patch, cabbage patch, something dense. I imagined like a floating junkyard. If you were in a canoe, I imagined you have to poke your way through it. And there are in fact old legends from the Sargasso Sea about there being mysterious floating islands of stranded derelict vessels and the like. And that's the sort of thing that I pictured. But in fact, it's scattered across millions of miles of oceans, and because plastic gets brittle and breaks down, you're not going to see, you'll see it every now and then, fishing floats, jugs, all sorts of things out there, but you really would have to hunt for them. Much more voluminous is this kind of thing, plastic that's broken down. Eventually, it all turns into essentially a kind of plastic dust that blows through the water column like dust through air. Down at the south point of Hawaii, where that picture was taken, it's actually, if you're in Hawaii and are looking for, something a little depressing to do, you can go down to the very southern tip of Hawaii, which is the southernmost point of the United States. You can even buy the southernmost bread in the United States while you're down. There's a 9-mile stretch of coastline, gorgeous gnarled tumors of lava rock that just collects this stuff, and it will sort them, the coves will sort them. This beach is the very end of that coastline, and as the waves grind them down, they get finer and finer and finer. So I went out with this fellow, Captain Charlie Moore, who has probably is the person most responsible for raising awareness about the plastic out in the North Pacific. And we went trawling in his catamaran and sailboat off the southern coast of Hawaii. And what he's holding there is the cod end of a trawl net, and this is how you have to do it. You have to catch it in fine gauze, and then sort through it with a toothbrush in a petri dish, and then weigh it on finely tuned scales, all those instruments we heard about earlier, in order to really reckon how much of it is out there. Which brings us back to this. So the reason why this image is a bit illusory, and the reason why I think it's useful to keep in mind Garrett Hardin's warning about the morality of an act not being determinable from a photograph, is when you look at this photo, you'll see it's a Greenpeace ad, and there's the caption, "How to Starve to Death on a Full Stomach." It's a visceral image, and it's shocking, and you think to yourself, it seems almost accusatory. Dear consumer, look where your disposable plastics end up. Right? But it's a more complicated story. I visited with wildlife biologists who are in charge of this sanctuary in the northwestern Hawaiian Islands, and they were quick to point out to me. They said, "Well, everyone loves to see those pictures, and they're horrible." But in fact, a few things. One, so where is this plastic coming from? How's it getting to the bird? The grown-up lays and albatross is a magnificent creature. It can fly hundreds of miles. They can fly asleep. They can cross the entire North Pacific. And they go to those same fronts where the same areas where the currents carry flotsam. And they'll swoop down and forage for their favorite thing is squid, but they'll also settle for barnacles and the spawn of flying fish. And some of those things have always evolved to raft on flotsam. So that even before there was plastic in the ocean, albatrosses would scoop up a little piece of pumice or driftwood. They have amazing digestive tracts, these birds. If you've ever seen the squid of a beak, the beak of a squid, not the squid of a beak. They're sharp and pointy. They look like a bird's beak, and they will eat those too. So that's one thing. They're not doing it because they're dumb and mistake it for something yummy. And there actually is nutritional value to it. Second thing I was told by this wildlife ornithologist is that far more dangerous for the albatross population. It's actually recovered enormously from the early 1900s because people used to harvest albatross feathers for ladies' hats. And they would just take the feathers and leave the birds and decimated populations. So in some ways, the albatross is doing better now than it was a century ago. But the thing that's the greatest danger, it's a threatened species. There are a couple of things. One, longline fishing. The adult birds, when they swoop down to catch squid will get caught on a hook. And if you lose one adult, you're also going to lose the fledgling back on the rookery on Lakes and Island. It requires both parents. So just for population dynamics, the death of those parents at sea has a greater impact because they can have many chicks over the course of their lifetime. Secondly, even for the chicks, plastic isn't the worst of it. They've got a species of ground cover, golden verbena. It's invasive, not indigenous to the Lakes and Islands. And the Lakes and Islands, maybe we should go back just to show where we are. It's right down here, Lakes and Island, midway. All of these are protected sanctuary now, these islands here. And it's the very southern edge of the albatross habitat. They tend to stay up here, the adults. And they only come down here because it's isolated and safe for them to have rookeries, no predators to eat the eggs. Apparently they'll even lay their eggs on, there was a golf course on Midway. You had to watch out for the birds. So it's at the southern edge of that habitat, which means that they prefer colder weather than they get down here. So what happens when this ground cover comes in is it's increasing the temperature at the ground level where the chicks are. and the chicks are dying. The main thing that's causing, for all we know, even this chick may not have died from all that plastic. The biggest cause of their death is dehydration because of the rising temperature. Global warming doesn't help so far as that goes, too. So what killed the albatross is a hard one to say. That said, the biologists I spoke to agreed it's certainly not good for them. But the reason why that question matters is if we take action on something, we're going to actually try to remove that plastic from the ocean. Well, one, it's impossible. But if we're going to spend all of our resources responding to the graphic visual image, rather than, say, cleaning up the lead paint from the old army base on Midway, which is also poisoning the birds, it can be done a lot more cheaply. So it's important, I think, for the morality of the act to stop and think about it and figure out who's to blame, what it means, what should be done. So towards that end, the what should be done question, I traveled on one of my journeys to Gore Point. And with a ragtag group of conservationists, sorry, I tried to focus, very well intentioned to this wild isthmus in the Alaskan wilderness. Their solution was airlift it out. And that's what they did. They spent about 6 weeks, lots of money in boat fuel, and all that stuff in the barge is over 50 tons of flotsam from 1 half-mile stretch of beach on the Alaskan coast that happens to collect stuff from the current. Whoops. So much for that photo. Oh, yes. So, how am I doing on time? We've got a little time. I guess I'll just do this last thing, and I'll wrap up. After all these travels, I returned to trying to imagine what happened to these toys after they spilled. So, picture a red beaver, a blue turtle, a green frog, a yellow duck, one set of toys hatched from the same plastic shell. It's February 1992, a month after the spill. Carried east by a current known as the North Pacific Drift, the 4 toys have traveled over 200 miles. They've remained close together and relatively close to the other 28,796 castaway toys traveling the current in a diffuse flock, smiling refugees on a possibly interminable road, prisoners in the labyrinth of drift, a labyrinth that is the collaborative work of invisible architects, the spinning of the planet and the heat of the sun, the saltness of the sea, and the influence of the winds. Squalls come and go, snow falls in swirling flurries, melting on contact with the ocean's surface, which out here in the graveyard of the Pacific is cold but not freezing, 5 degrees Celsius, 41 degrees Fahrenheit. The moon is growing full, and on those nights when the sky is clear, it paints on the wave crest a triangle of white lines that diminish toward a vanishing point on the horizon. Viewed from the deck of a nearby container ship, the lines of moonshine on the black water seem to climb into the black sky like the rungs of Jacob's ladder. It's the incongruity of the toys that above all things enchants me. In June, 690 miles southwest of Sitka, for the first time since the spill, dramatic complications occur. As it collides with the continental shelf and then with the fresh water gushing out of the rainforests of the coastal mountains, and then with the coast, the North Pacific Drift loses its coherence, crazy, sends out fractal meanders and eddies and tendrils that tease the 4 voyagers apart. We don't know for certain what happens next, but statistical models suggest that at least one of the 4 voyagers, I'm imagining, the frog, let's pretend, will turn south, carried by an eddy or a meander into the California current, which will likely deliver it after many months into the North Pacific subtropical gyre. You may now forget about the frog. We already know its story, how as it disintegrates, it will contribute a few tablespoons of plastic to the North Pacific, or to Hawaii's plastic beach. Bon voyage, petit grenouille. May the fatal threads of ocean currents spare you from a plundering albatross and spare an albatross chick from you. The other 3 toys turn north. In November 92, the Alaska coastal current carries one of them, the turtle, let's pretend, onto Kruzof Island, where it will remain caught in the jackstraw until a beachcomber named Tyler Orbison comes sloshing ashore the following summer. You may forget about the turtle. Hundreds of other toys make landfall on the Alaskan Peninsula that November. By January 10th, but thousands, including the duck, and the beaver, I've asked you to imagine, keep bobbing along on a northerly bearing. At Kayak Island, north of Juneau, the currents make a sharp westerly left. By January 10th, the first anniversary of the spill, the beaver and duck have reached the entrance to Prince William Sound, passing Bly Reef, named for the notorious sea captain, made famous by the notorious tanker that running aground spilled its oil there just 3 years before the Evergreen Everlaurel spilled its toys. A few weeks later, traveling the same route, roughly as that sounds crude, the toys reached Gore Point's windward shore. A southeaster blows up, and a storm surge lobs the beaver over the driftwood berm. Hurricane-force winds lift it aloft, send it tumbling across the forest floor, pluck it up again, drop it again, until finally it comes to rest in the lee of the spruce, where for 14 years it remains until, on July 16th, 2007, along comes an erstwhile school teacher, me, turned amateur driftologist. He bends back the leaf of Devil's Club with the toe of his rubber boot and, careful not to strain the surgically repaired lumbar region, just had a lot of back surgery, crouches down, hollering with ridiculous excitement. You may now forget about the beaver. You may not forget about the duck, however. At least not if you're me. If you're me, prey to nocturnal flights of fancy, you will spend many years thinking about that stupid, sun-bleached, ghostly, hollow, iconic, and altogether hypothetical plaything with a body the size of a bar of soap and a head the size of a ping-pong ball. Out on the Alaskan current, as it has escaped the witch's finger of Gore Point, it is now headed along with thousands of other toys towards the Aleutians. Most will remain, the computer simulations and computer models will predict in the subpolar gyrus orbit, completing a lap once every few years, their numbers diminishing with every lap. Some will end up on the rocky shores of the mostly uninhabited Aleutians, others in Siberia. Others, after completing a lap or two, will return to Alaska and join some Fargo of wrack in some out-of-the-way cave of ocean. And some, not many, the computer models tell us, will slip between the Aleutian Islands and into the Bering Sea, where under favorable circumstances, an even smaller number, including, let's pretend, the once yellow, now pale duck I'm imagining, will pass through the Bering Strait and into the Arctic. There, Oscars had lost them, and so had I. Truth be told, by the time the Hanjin Ottawa, I came home from China by container ship. I wanted to cross the North Pacific at the height of the winter storm season and see what it was like. It was actually really kind of boring because the house of a container ship feels like a business class hotel from which you can never leave. But I did learn a bunch on the trip anyway. By the time the Hanjin Ottawa passed through the Strait of Juan de Fuca, I'd had enough of seafaring. At the entrance to Puget Sound, the launch motored out. A harbor crowd came aboard. Landfall in Conrad's time, as in ours, is another matter. Sorry, I skipped a bit. I should not have done that. A departure, the last professional sight of land, is always good, or at least good enough, Conrad writes in The Mirror of the Sea. Landfall, in his time as in ours, is another matter. It cannot be entrusted to the autopilot, nor even to the helmsman or master, which is why the harbor pilot, who knew Puget Sound by heart, appeared on the Ottawa's bridge carrying a duffel bag of charts. Occasionally consulting the radar screen, mostly studying the scenery ahead, he called out numerical bearings, and the helmsman called the bearings back in confirmation. The rest of us, even Captain Jakubowski, stood by, gazing through the glass in passive silence, faces luminously masked by the glowing screens, waiting for Greater Seattle to appear on the dark horizon. And when it finally did appear on the horizon, like some resurrected 21st century Atlantis rising up out of the water into the night sky, which had polluted deliciously with light, an electrical dawn, my spirits rose too. I'd had enough of seafaring. I was ready to fly, not sail, carbon footprint be damned, to the insular city of the Manhattas and stay there a good long while, ready to pen myself up in lath and plaster, tie myself to a counter, nail myself to a bench, or clinch myself to a desk, so long as that pending tying, nailing, or clinching came with decent health benefits and a retirement plan. Ready to circumambulate the city of a dreamy Sabbath afternoon in the company of my long-suffering wife and my paternally neglected son. In short, I was ready to come home. But I couldn't, not yet. What I've gone searching for and yet to be found. I had one last riddle to puzzle out, one last journey to take, or rather to finish. It had begun one September morning before I went sailing with Charlie Moore, or visited the Posting Plastic Works, or crossed the Pacific on the Hanjin Ottawa at the height of the winter storm season. It would end months later, after a long hiatus and numerous detours, deep in the interior of the Canadian Arctic, on the icy shores of the Northwest Passage. The stars at the heart. So, oh, it didn't work. I was going to show you a picture of me walking on the ice with a helicopter. I'm not going to tell you whether I solved the mystery or continue. I don't want to spoil the ending. But there you go. Thank you.
Sure. I'm going to take the introducer's prerogative of asking you the first of the 28,800, which I now understand are 4 different species. How many have been sent in response to the Beachcombers newsletter?
The last number I saw, which was a couple of years ago, it was over 1,000. It was somewhere between 1,000 and 2,000. But that trip to Gore Point, people discovered dozens, so there are more out there. Probably on coastlines or disintegrating.
Questions from the audience?
Are there any estimates on how many are still floating out there?
Well, there would have to be, we don't know how many are floating or whether they're stuck behind a spruce tree. Odds are, and especially up in that Gulf of Alaska, because those currents send flotsam towards shore, most of them would have washed up by now. So really only if they drift south, north of Hawaii in that convergence zone, that they would still be adrift. Or perhaps they're somewhere. One likes if they were, in theory, if they survived the journey across the Arctic, there could be some in the Atlantic by now, there could be some in the Indian Ocean by now. Yeah?
Any idea how many might have sunk if they split in the sunlight?
I mean, I should have brought it as a prop, but that duck that I found in Alaska, as an experiment, I stuck it in my freezer in a Ziploc bag, and it's so brittle to the touch that it just crumbled. It's now that stuff. So I think that ultimately is the fate of all of them. For some reason, the beavers and ducks go faster. If it's the dives, the turtles and the frogs are a little more durable. So maybe a turtle will make it. Yeah.
I'm curious what the focus of the student paper was, the one that originally charmed you.
I used to, years ago, edit the annotation section of Harper's Magazine, where you take an artifact or a document and you investigate it, study it, and try to tell a story around it. So that's what I have my students do. So he picked it, and he looked it up in the news archives and described it and found rubber duck trivia, revised it a couple of times, and then at the end of the semester I said, do you mind if I run with this? And he said, fine. He turned out that he's now a journalist. He's a sports writer, which is what he always wanted to do. He's writing for Moby-Duck. Evan Drell. Yeah.
Could you tell me what was found by the ecologist where the degradation of plastic was greatest?
Let me see if I understand your question. What was found as in aside from the plastic?
Which aspect in terms of both water temperature as well as latitude might have had the greatest effect on the degradation of plastic?
Yeah, so I mean, certainly if it's at the things that are closer to the surface are going to degrade faster in the sunlight. And when you go out trawling for it, I mean, it's all that area of the North Pacific is a marine desert. They're calm and it's hot. So that seems to be one of the worst places is right there in Hawaii, north of Hawaii. And there are a number of the impact of it is there's the birds that eat it, of course, and all that. There's some theories, and they're still hypothetical. Plastic has the property of absorbing certain substances in the water, lipophilic, hydrophobic substances, which include PCBs and DDT. So I actually took the beaver I found in Alaska and sent it to a chemist who sacrificed it in the lab to her mass spectrometer. And lo and behold, there were spiked high levels of PCBs that it had collected on its journey. Whether or not that's amplifying the way those toxins get into the food web is an area of ongoing research. We do know that animals at the top of the marine food web, whales, albatrosses, have really high contaminant burdens.
You showed the effects of the various plastics and stuff that return. What are the effects, do we know of stomach acid and large sea mammals ingesting these.
I wish I had this. I'm not going to find it. I've got a footnote in the book. There was a dead gray whale that walked up near Seattle, and they necropsied it, and there's a long list. It's almost entertaining. The stuff they found: golf balls, a package of Capri Sun. So it doesn't biodegrade, so it's not gonna break down.
It's not going to break down. So it's not as detrimental as you might expect it to be.
Oh, I mean,
It doesn't break down?
it doesn't break. I don't know if that's good though. I mean, usually you want things to be biodegradable and digestible. So
Do
maybe.
they pass it?
I don't know. I'm not going to pretend to speak for all species. The albatrosses do some of it. So some of it will block an intestine or perforate or all sorts of unpleasant stuff. So yeah.
Looking on the bright side of all this, could these 28,000 things become substrates for marine organisms to live on?
Yeah, that's great. The zooplankton spawn like the raft on there, the barnacles. Sure, they're happy.
There you went, Mark.
Assuming that not all those containers that fell over contain rubber duckies, what else is lost?
Well, I don't know, because there's the only one, the most containers that fall overboard, and actually it happens more regularly than I ever thought, sink. It has to be something that's buoyant, that escapes, which is why there have been a number of studies done on Nikes because they float. But the toys are kind of perfect because they're made for the bathtub and everybody can find them. So I can't tell you what was in the other 12 containers, and no one really knows exactly how many fall overboard every year, but the worst cargo loss disaster, I've devoted a chapter to, the APL China in 1998 lost 407 containers on a single night while crossing from the Far East to Seattle. And luckily for me, it was such a huge loss that I went to court. Most of these things are just settled between underwriters and cargo owners. So in the Manhattan courthouse, you could get a whole cartload of documents that listed all the stuff that was in those 407 containers. It was everything you can imagine. It was clothes from the Gap. It was Toshiba lost a whole lot of wireless, cordless phones, swing bicycles, seafood in the refrigerated containers. It was fun to find all that. Yeah. Did you say, was that the last one?
Well, we ought to allow you time to sign the book. I was going to ask you what you did with the little rubber ducky that was given to you, but now I appear to be frozen in a fall ride, and I figure you probably had under a glass
the factory in China gave me, you don't want to sell those, but since they have the mold out anyway, they were in the office. So I have some. My kids play with them. No, I'm not many, but still.
Donovan Hohn, Moby-Duck, many thanks.
Thank you.